You are not lazy, you are divided. The exhaustion you feel is not a lack of ambition. It is the psychological cost of carrying two opposing identities inside one nervous system. You wake up with visions of greatness, you imagine success, transformation, influence, creative mastery. Yet when action calls your name, something inside you withdraws. Hours disappear, plans dissolve, discipline evaporates, and afterward comes guilt, heavy, sharp, humiliating. You believe something is wrong with your willpower. But according to Jung and the Jungian understanding of the psyche, this inner paralysis is not weakness. It is a civil war between the ego and the shadow. In the next few minutes, your idea of laziness will collapse. You will see that what looks like procrastination is often a hidden defense mechanism designed to protect you from confronting a deeper psychological truth. And once you see it, you will never interpret your inaction the same way again. There is a peculiar psychological structure inside the person who feels both intensely ambitious and strangely immobile. It is not a simple contradiction. It is not hypocrisy. It is not weakness. It is a split orientation of the soul. On one side, there is a genuine hunger for transcendence, a fascination with philosophy, self-development, spiritual awakening, success psychology, shadow work, manifestation, purpose. This person does not think in small terms. Their mind moves toward destiny, impact, mastery. They imagine the future version of themselves standing at a higher altitude, more disciplined, more powerful, more self-actualized. They feel magnetized by greatness. On the other side, there is a contraction. It appears at the exact moment when imagination must translate into movement, when the abstract vision demands physical embodiment, when the dream requires structure, repetition, risk, exposure. Something inside tightens, attention drifts, the body becomes heavy, urgency dissolves. The modern world interprets this as procrastination. Productivity culture calls it dopamine addiction. Social media psychology reduces it to distraction loops and overstimulation. But the Jungian understanding suggests that beneath these surface explanations lies a more symbolic drama. Jung proposed that the psyche is not a unified machine, but a dynamic system of inner forces. The ego believes it is in control, yet it is only one center of consciousness among many. The persona negotiates social approval. The shadow stores rejected traits and disowned impulses. The deeper self seeks wholeness rather than applause. When ambition arises, it often originates in the ego and persona. It forms through comparison, aspiration, ideals absorbed from culture. You see what society rewards: influence, wealth, intellectual dominance, spiritual authority, and the ego constructs an image. I will become that. There is nothing inherently false about ambition. It can be noble, it can be a call from the deeper self, but it can also be compensation. If the ego secretly feels small, it may inflate a grand vision to counterbalance insecurity. If the persona fears invisibility, it may crave recognition to stabilize identity. If childhood experiences created a wound of inadequacy, ambition can become a strategy to repair it. The unconscious observes all of this, and the unconscious is not naive. If ambition is driven by unexamined insecurity rather than authentic alignment, the shadow resists, not loudly, not dramatically. It resists through inertia. This is where the cold layer beneath the fire appears. The individual may spend hours researching productivity methods, listening to motivational content, studying mystical teachings, analyzing success strategies. The inner world feels active. The outer world remains unchanged. Why? Because part of the psyche does not trust the ambition. There is also the dimension of exposure. To pursue a large vision means to be seen, to publish your thoughts, launch your project, speak your truth, attempt greatness. This removes the protective cloak of anonymity. And visibility threatens the fragile architecture of identity. If you remain in potential, you can imagine yourself extraordinary. If you act, the world will respond with feedback. Feedback is concrete. It reduces fantasy into measurable reality. Many ambitious individuals unconsciously prefer the intoxication of imagined greatness to the vulnerability of tested effort. The psyche calculates risk in subtle ways. It asks, if I try and fail, will my self-concept survive? If I reveal my true capacity, will others judge me? If I succeed, will I outgrow relationships that define me? These questions rarely surface consciously. Instead, they appear as fatigue, distraction, lack of motivation. There is also a deeper existential layer. Ambition is not merely about achievement, it is about identity transformation. To become something greater requires shedding former versions of yourself. Old friendships may no longer resonate, comfort zones must dissolve. The familiar narrative of who you are begins to crack. The ego says it wants growth. The nervous system fears the loss of familiarity. The result is ambivalence. The soul desires expansion. The body prefers safety. In Jungian language, this tension reflects the conflict between individuation and adaptation. Adaptation keeps you integrated within society's expectations. Individuation pulls you toward your unique psychological destiny. If your ambition serves adaptation, meaning it aligns with what others value, it may lack depth. If it serves individuation, it will demand confrontation with shadow material, insecurity, envy, fear of inadequacy, fear of superiority, suppressed anger, hidden longing. This confrontation is uncomfortable, so the psyche negotiates by slowing down. It is important to understand that resistance is intelligent. It is not random laziness. It often signals that something unresolved lies beneath the surface of the goal. For example, imagine you want to build a powerful online presence in philosophy and mysticism. Consciously, you crave influence. Unconsciously, you may fear criticism. You may fear being misunderstood. You may fear discovering that your knowledge is incomplete. The shadow contains both inferiority and superiority. It may hold the secret belief that you are destined for greatness, alongside the secret fear that you are ordinary. To act would expose which belief is true. Remaining inactive allows both fantasies to coexist. This is psychologically comfortable, even if emotionally painful. There is another subtle mechanism at work. Ambition creates internal pressure. Pressure activates anxiety. Anxiety triggers avoidance behaviors. Avoidance temporarily reduces discomfort, reinforcing the pattern. From the outside, it looks like poor discipline. From the inside, it is a loop designed to maintain psychological equilibrium. Jung emphasized that the psyche strives for balance. If one aspect becomes too inflated, such as grand ambition, the unconscious may compensate by pulling in the opposite direction. This compensation can manifest as lethargy. The more grandiose the conscious self-image becomes, the more the unconscious may introduce doubt and stagnation to restore balance. The individual then feels split between a visionary and a procrastinator, but both are parts of the same organism. The visionary imagines the future. The resisting force protects the current identity from disintegration. Until these forces communicate, the conflict continues. This is why self-help strategies often fail for the lazy yet ambitious personality. They address behavior without addressing inner polarity. They increase pressure without resolving the split. They amplify the ego's demand for productivity without integrating the shadow's fear. True transformation requires dialogue with the deeper layers of the psyche. It requires asking whether your ambition is a mask, a compensation, or a calling. It requires examining whether your resistance is cowardice or wisdom. When you begin to see your inertia not as stupidity but as symbolic language, something shifts. You realize that the stillness has meaning. The delay contains information. The heaviness points toward unresolved psychological material. The fire and the cold are not enemies. They are signals from different levels of your being. And until those levels align, motion will remain inconsistent. The soul may want the sun, but if the ego seeks it for the wrong reasons, the shadow will pull you back into the shade. Doing nothing is not empty. It is strategic. This is the layer that most people never examine because it feels too uncomfortable to admit. Inaction is not always the absence of movement. Sometimes it is a calculated psychological defense designed to preserve an illusion. As long as you do not act, your potential remains sacred. Untouched potential feels infinite. It carries no proof of limitation. It floats above reality like a myth about yourself. You can imagine writing a revolutionary book. You can picture building a powerful brand around philosophy and mysticism. You can see yourself mastering shadow work, becoming intellectually formidable, emotionally sovereign. In imagination, there are no constraints. Reality introduces constraints. And this is where tension begins. The moment you translate vision into behavior, the world responds. Metrics appear, feedback arrives. Silence from others becomes information. Criticism becomes concrete. Growth becomes measurable rather than abstract. Measurement collapses fantasy. If you never publish, you cannot be ignored. If you never launch, you cannot fail publicly. If you never commit, you cannot discover the true depth of your discipline. This creates a hidden psychological contract. Protect the myth by postponing the test. You might consciously tell yourself that you need more preparation, more research, a better strategy, the right timing, another certification, more clarity. On the surface, this appears responsible. Underneath, something subtler operates. You are preserving the image of who you believe you could be. Jung observed that the ego constructs idealized self-images as a way to stabilize identity. These images are not inherently false, but they become dangerous when they are fragile. If your internal image says, "I am extraordinary," but it has never been validated through disciplined effort, it remains hypothetical. Hypothetical greatness feels powerful because it cannot be disproven. Action introduces the possibility of contradiction. You may discover that you are not as skilled as you imagined. You may discover that mastery requires years rather than months. You may discover that your strengths lie in a different direction entirely. This discovery threatens the ego's narrative, so the psyche hesitates. There is also a deeper and more unsettling possibility. What if your inaction is not protecting you from failure, but from transformation? To truly pursue ambition is to enter a process that will alter you. Your habits must change. Your environment must evolve. Your identity must reorganize. The person who achieves the goal cannot remain identical to the person who fantasized about it. This means loss. You may lose the comfort of being the potential genius. You may lose the identity built around being misunderstood but brilliant. You may lose relationships that depend on you staying small. Staying inactive preserves your current ecosystem. There is familiarity in stagnation. There is predictability in unrealized dreams. The unknown is destabilizing, and the unconscious often prioritizes stability over expansion. Another hidden layer involves superiority and inferiority coexisting in the shadow. The ambitious yet inactive individual frequently oscillates between feeling exceptional and feeling inadequate. One day you sense that you're ahead of your time, capable of profound insight. The next day you doubt your intelligence and question your worth. If you act, one of these narratives will weaken. If you remain still, both can survive. You can continue believing you are extraordinary while blaming circumstances for lack of progress. You can continue believing you are disadvantaged while secretly holding on to fantasies of greatness. Inaction allows contradiction to persist. This is psychologically convenient. The Jungian perspective suggests that unresolved shadow material seeks expression. If you have suppressed fear of humiliation, it may manifest as avoidance. If you have suppressed envy towards successful individuals, it may manifest as quiet resentment combined with inaction. If you have suppressed a fear of surpassing your family's expectations, it may appear as chronic self-sabotage. You might think you are simply distracted. In truth, you may be protecting an unconscious loyalty. Sometimes doing nothing is a way of staying aligned with the emotional contracts formed in childhood. If achievement once triggered criticism, jealousy, or rejection, your nervous system remembers. It associates visibility with danger. Your conscious mind says, "I want success." Your deeper conditioning says, "Success costs connection." The result is paralysis. There is also the fear of discovering ordinariness. This is rarely spoken about. Many ambitious individuals secretly fear that if they give their full effort, they might still be average. As long as effort remains partial, failure can be blamed on inconsistency. But if you commit completely and still do not reach the imagined heights, the ego must restructure itself. That restructuring feels like psychological death. So the mind chooses partial engagement. You work just enough to maintain the illusion of capability, but not enough to risk definitive evaluation. This is the hidden contract of inaction. Remain in the realm of possibility rather than enter the arena of proof. And yet there is tragedy in this strategy. Potential that is never tested begins to decay. The longer it remains abstract, the more it transforms from inspiration into quiet frustration. What once felt empowering starts to feel heavy. The gap between vision and reality widens, producing guilt and self-criticism. The defense mechanism that once protected your ego becomes the source of your suffering. Jung would argue that this tension is an invitation. The psyche does not create conflict without purpose. When inaction becomes painful, it signals that the strategy is no longer sustainable. The illusion of infinite potential no longer satisfies. The soul demands embodiment. This is the turning point. You begin to sense that preserving the myth costs more than risking exposure. You realize that true confidence cannot be imagined into existence. It must be forged through confrontation with limitation. And here is the profound shift. The goal is not to prove you are extraordinary. The goal is to integrate who you actually are. When you no longer need to protect the fantasy version of yourself, action becomes less threatening. You are no longer acting to defend an image. You are acting to explore reality. The hidden contract dissolves. In its place emerges something quieter but more powerful: willingness. Willingness to try, willingness to be seen, willingness to discover the truth about your capacity. At that moment, inaction loses its function, because there is nothing left to protect. At the center of this entire psychological drama lies a truth that is both liberating and destabilizing. What you call laziness may actually be misalignment between the ego and the deeper self. In Jungian psychology, the ego is not the totality of who you are. It is the conscious identity, the voice that says, I want, I should, I must become. It constructs plans, compares itself to others, imagines future versions of success. It feeds on goals because goals provide structure. But beneath the ego exists the self. Not the social self, not the performative self, but the organizing center of the psyche. The self seeks wholeness, not validation. It seeks integration, not applause. It is less concerned with status and more concerned with psychological truth. When ambition arises, you must ask, who is speaking? If ambition is generated primarily by the ego, it often carries tension. It feels urgent, pressured, slightly anxious. It compares constantly. It measures itself against other people's timelines. It wants to be impressive. If ambition arises from alignment with the self, it feels different. There is intensity, but not desperation. There is focus, but not frantic comparison. The work feels meaningful even when no one is watching. The lazy yet ambitious state frequently emerges when the ego's goals are not endorsed by the self. The ego says, I must build something extraordinary so I can finally feel worthy. The self remains silent, or worse, it resists. This resistance does not manifest as philosophical insight. It manifests as fatigue. It manifests as endless scrolling, as starting and stopping, as planning without execution. It feels like a mysterious heaviness that no productivity system can dissolve. From the outside, it appears as inconsistency. From the inside, it is an existential mismatch. Jung described neurosis as a split between conscious intention and unconscious truth. When the ego moves in one direction and the deeper psyche pulls in another, tension accumulates. The more force the ego applies, the stronger the unconscious counterforce becomes. This is why pure discipline often fails for certain personalities. The ego attempts to dominate the psyche through willpower. The unconscious responds with sabotage. You promise yourself a strict routine. Within days, resistance intensifies. You double down on motivation. The resistance grows stronger. Eventually, you collapse into avoidance and self-criticism. The issue is not a lack of intelligence. Many individuals in this state are deeply analytical, philosophically inclined, capable of abstract reasoning. They understand human behavior. They can explain shadow work, manifestation, archetypes, consciousness, yet knowledge does not automatically create alignment. The core question becomes unavoidable. Is your ambition truly yours? Modern culture implants desires subtly. Social media normalizes certain forms of success. Online philosophy communities glorify intellectual dominance. Self-improvement culture equates productivity with virtue. Without noticing, the ego absorbs these signals and constructs a narrative. If I achieve this, I will be significant. But the self cannot be deceived by borrowed narratives. If the path you are pursuing does not resonate with your authentic psychological structure, the unconscious slows you down. This slowdown is often interpreted as failure. In a deeper sense, it can be protection. Consider the possibility that your psyche is refusing to build a life that does not belong to you. If you are pursuing a vision that is rooted in comparison, the process will drain you. If you are building something purely to escape insecurity, the motivation will fluctuate. If your ambition is an attempt to outrun unresolved shadow material, the shadow will not cooperate. There is also the dimension of inflation. Jung warned about ego inflation, when the conscious self over-identifies with grand images of importance. Inflation feels powerful at first. It produces visions of destiny, fantasies of impact, intense identification with archetypes like the visionary, the genius, the awakened one. But inflation is unstable. When the ego inflates beyond its integrated capacity, the unconscious compensates with deflation. Doubt increases, energy decreases, the sense of inadequacy emerges. The psyche attempts to restore equilibrium. This oscillation between grand ambition and paralyzing inertia is not random, it is a compensatory rhythm. The ego rises, the unconscious pulls it down. Until humility and integration occur, the cycle repeats. The deeper self does not require you to be extraordinary. It requires you to be real. This is where the misunderstanding lies. You may believe that your lack of action proves you are not meant for greatness. In reality, it may be signaling that the version of greatness you are chasing is not aligned with your authentic design. Alignment does not eliminate effort. It transforms the quality of effort. When ego and self cooperate, work becomes grounded. You no longer need to fantasize about being exceptional because you are engaged in something meaningful. The comparison loses its grip. The process itself generates stability. Energy returns not because the task became easier, but because the internal conflict dissolved. The Jungian path of individuation demands confrontation with the shadow before external conquest. It demands integration before expansion. It demands self-knowledge before self-promotion. If you attempt to skip this process, your psyche will resist, not to punish you, but to prevent fragmentation. True ambition is not about becoming larger than others, it is about becoming integrated within yourself. And integration requires courage, the courage to examine your motives, to dismantle inflated self-images, to release goals that were never truly yours. Once this happens, something remarkable occurs. Action becomes less dramatic. You no longer chase transformation as an escape from who you are. You act as an expression of who you are. The heavy resistance that once felt like laziness begins to dissolve, not because you forced it into submission, but because it no longer has a reason to exist. The ego and the self move in the same direction. And when that alignment occurs, ambition stops feeling like pressure. It starts feeling like destiny grounded in reality. There is a dimension of this struggle that rarely gets spoken aloud. It is not the ambition, it is not the philosophy, it is not even the resistance, it is the quiet shame. You walk through your days carrying an unspoken awareness that you are capable of more, not in an arrogant way, in a subtle, persistent way. You sense depth in your thinking, you perceive patterns others overlook. You feel drawn to psychology, shadow work, mysticism, consciousness, self-mastery. Your inner world is active, complex, layered, but your outer life does not yet mirror that depth, and that discrepancy creates friction. You watch people execute ideas with less introspection. You see others build platforms, businesses, movements, even when their thinking feels simplistic compared to yours. Part of you admires their courage, another part cannot understand why you remain still. You tell yourself you're preparing, you tell yourself you are refining your vision. But beneath those explanations, there is a small, persistent voice asking, if I am truly capable, why am I not moving? That question can become corrosive. It slowly transforms admiration into self-doubt. It turns philosophical reflection into over-analysis. It converts stillness into accusation. This is where compassion becomes necessary. Because what you are experiencing is not stupidity. It is not laziness in the shallow sense. It is the pressure of becoming conscious of your own depth without yet knowing how to embody it. Many individuals who resonate with Jungian ideas are highly introspective. They think before acting. They analyze motives. They sense contradictions within themselves. This sensitivity is a strength, but it also slows movement. You do not want to build something false. You do not want to act from ego alone. You want alignment. But while you search for alignment, time passes, and the world does not reward internal complexity. It rewards visible output. So you begin comparing your internal richness to your external results. The comparison hurts. You may even feel like an imposter. Not because you are pretending to be more than you are, but because you believe you are failing to express what you truly are. This creates a peculiar loneliness. Outwardly, you function. You may even appear composed and intelligent. Inwardly, you feel suspended between who you could become and who you currently are. There is also grief involved. Grief for the years you believe you have wasted. Grief for projects never started. Grief for versions of yourself that remained theoretical. And yet something important must be understood. Depth develops in silence. While others were moving quickly, you were observing. While others were acting impulsively, you were studying patterns. While others chased visibility, you were building inner architecture. The pain arises because you mistake incubation for stagnation. Jung spoke about the necessity of descending into the unconscious before rising into individuation. That descent often feels unproductive. It does not produce immediate external rewards. It produces insight, self-awareness, confrontation with shadow material. You may have been doing this work without labeling it as such. The frustration you feel is the tension between inner growth and outer expression. And yes, there is responsibility involved. Reflection must eventually translate into embodiment. Insight must become action. Individuation is not completed in thought alone. But the shame you carry is heavier than the truth of your situation. Nothing is wrong with you. You are navigating complexity. The world simplifies human psychology into slogans. Just do it. Hustle harder. Stop overthinking. These commands ignore the fact that some personalities cannot move authentically without meaning. You are not built for shallow execution. You are built for integrated action. The problem is not that you have not moved fast enough. The problem is that you have been judging your pace through the lens of people who are structured differently. There is also a deeper fear hidden inside the shame. If you finally commit and give your full effort, there will be no more excuses, no more blaming circumstances, no more protecting your potential. You will confront your real capacity. That confrontation is intimidating. As long as you remain partially engaged, your identity remains flexible. But full engagement solidifies reality. It reveals strengths and weaknesses with clarity, and clarity can feel brutal. So instead of attacking yourself, recognize the threshold you are standing on. You are not behind. You are at the edge of embodiment. The inner work you have done has prepared you for action that is authentic rather than performative. The hesitation you feel is the final resistance before integration. Shame says, you wasted time. Wisdom says, you were preparing. The key now is not to collapse into guilt. The key is to move, not to prove your worth, not to impress anyone, but to allow your inner depth to take form in the world. Because insight without expression eventually becomes frustration. And you were never meant to remain theoretical. You were meant to become real. There comes a moment when self-criticism no longer produces growth. You have analyzed yourself enough. You have blamed yourself enough. You have tried to force discipline through pressure, through comparison, through motivational intensity. It did not work. Not because you are incapable, but because force cannot resolve inner division. The next step is not aggression toward yourself. It is investigation. When resistance appears, instead of labeling it laziness, become curious about it. Treat it as information. Ask what function it serves. Ask what it is protecting. Ask which part of you feels threatened by forward movement. This is not passive reflection. It is conscious shadow work. The Jungian path requires dialogue between the ego and the unconscious. The ego cannot simply dominate. It must listen. When you feel the urge to avoid a task that supposedly aligns with your ambition, stop interpreting that avoidance as proof of inadequacy. Instead, ask, is this goal rooted in my authentic structure, or is it borrowed from comparison? If this project succeeded beyond expectation, would I feel internally expanded or merely validated in front of others? What identity would I have to release in order to pursue this fully? These questions are destabilizing because they threaten illusions, but they also dissolve unnecessary resistance. You may discover that some ambitions were never yours. They were adopted to fill a void. They were constructed to silence insecurity. They were shaped by admiration of someone else's path, rather than by recognition of your own nature. Let those ambitions go. Releasing them is not failure, it is refinement. You may also discover that the goal is authentic, but fear of visibility has been disguised as disinterest. Visibility requires courage. It exposes you to judgment, misunderstanding, projection. If you are psychologically sensitive, that exposure feels intense. Do not deny that sensitivity. Strength is not the absence of vulnerability. It is the willingness to act despite it. There is another layer to awakening: responsibility without violence. You do not need to attack yourself into motion, but you do need to accept that insight alone will not change your external reality. The world responds to embodied action. Begin smaller than your ego prefers. The ego wants dramatic transformation, sudden productivity, rapid success, undeniable proof of worth. The deeper self prefers consistency and integrity. Choose a direction that feels real, not grand. Then move toward it in a way that is sustainable. This is not about dramatic reinvention, it is about alignment. When action is aligned, it does not feel like self-betrayal. It may feel uncomfortable, but the discomfort carries meaning rather than emptiness. There is a quiet sense that you are moving in harmony with yourself instead of against yourself. Pay attention to energy shifts. When you engage in work that resonates with your authentic structure, your nervous system responds differently. You may feel focused rather than scattered, tired but satisfied rather than drained and resentful, challenged but not internally divided. That difference is subtle but powerful. The awakening is not a mystical explosion. It is a reorientation. You stop trying to become impressive. You start trying to become integrated. You stop asking, "How do I look?" You start asking, "Is this true to who I am becoming?" Over time, something changes. The heavy resistance that once felt immovable begins to lose intensity, not because you defeated it, but because you understood it. The part of you that was protecting the ego no longer needs to guard a false image. You are no longer chasing ambition to escape yourself. You are expressing ambition as an extension of yourself. This shift creates momentum that feels different from motivation. Motivation fluctuates with mood. Alignment creates steadier movement. And here is the final responsibility. You must accept uncertainty. You will not know immediately whether you are extraordinary. You will not know your ultimate capacity in advance. You must be willing to discover it gradually. This requires humility. Humility does not mean shrinking. It means allowing reality to teach you who you are without collapsing your identity. When you act from this place, ambition becomes less theatrical and more grounded. You are not performing greatness. You are constructing it, step by step, with awareness. That is awakening in practical form, not fantasy, not ego inflation, but conscious participation in your own becoming. In the end, the story was never about laziness. It was about misunderstanding your own depth. You looked at your stillness and called it weakness. You looked at your hesitation and called it failure. You compared your timeline to louder personalities and concluded that something essential was missing in you. But the truth was quieter. You were not empty. You were divided. You were not incapable. You were misaligned. The fire inside you was real. The resistance was real. Both belonged to you. Both were signals. One pointed toward expansion. The other warned against fragmentation. When you interpret your life only through productivity metrics, you miss the psychological dimension unfolding beneath behavior. The psyche does not operate according to social media timelines. It unfolds according to integration. Some people move quickly because they are less divided. Others move slowly because they are carrying more complexity. Complexity is not a flaw. It becomes a burden only when you fight it instead of understanding it. The Jungian perspective reveals something profound. Paralysis often precedes individuation. Before the ego reorganizes itself around the deeper self, there is confusion. There is contradiction. There is a sense of standing between identities. That space feels uncomfortable because it lacks clarity, but it is sacred. You are shedding illusions about who you thought you needed to be. You are confronting shadow material that could not remain unconscious forever. You are wrestling with borrowed ambitions and fragile self-images. That process does not look impressive from the outside. From the inside, it is transformation. And now the choice becomes simple. You can continue protecting potential, keeping it abstract and safe, or you can risk discovering your real proportions, your actual strengths, your real limitations, your authentic direction. One path preserves fantasy. The other path builds identity. The second path requires courage, but not the dramatic kind. It requires steady honesty. It requires releasing the need to appear extraordinary before you have earned clarity. It requires acting not to impress, but to integrate. You do not need to become louder. You do not need to become someone else. You need to become coherent. When coherence replaces comparison, movement begins naturally. When ego and self stop competing, energy returns. When shadow is acknowledged rather than denied, resistance softens. The ambitious part of you was never the enemy. It was the signal of your potential. The resistant part of you was never the enemy either. It was the guardian of your psychological integrity. Now that you understand both, you no longer have to choose between dreaming and doing. You can act without betraying yourself. And when you finally move from that place, not from insecurity, not from inflation, not from borrowed desire, your actions will carry weight. Not because they are dramatic, but because they are true.